At the NFL Combine, Xavier Worthy became the fastest person to ever run the 40-yard dash with a time of 4.21 seconds. My immediate reaction, oh crap, my rankings are about to be very controversial now. I don't seek out to make controversial rankings, but my honest evaluation of Xavier Worthy still puts him closer to the wide receiver 10 range than the wide receiver 5 range, even after the amazing Combine time. This video is a bit of a defense for why and a segment of the Fantasy for Real podcast if anything sounds out of order. This podcast is linked in the description, and I'll get right on to the show. There's been a lot more chatter that I've seen putting Xavier Worthy closer to wide receiver 4, towards I think I would have said that the market was closer to, say, wide receiver 7 or 8 before the Combine. And to be clear, I don't think it's all the way up at wide receiver 4, but I see that conversation far more often. And for me, he's still at closer to wide receiver 10, and it would honestly still not shock me for him to be lower than that. Anywhere between wide receiver 8 and 13 to me would not shock me for Xavier Worthy right now, even after draft capital, depending on where players go. Because again, what I just touched on the last section, I don't really consider late first round draft capital to be a gold mine if I don't like a player. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's obviously always going to be a point, but with how often these players bust, if there's other things within a profile that makes me think they're going to bust, I don't really have too much of a problem knocking down my rankings too much. So the big thing with Xavier Worthy, I think, is that if you're someone who does models, if you're someone who has thresholds, almost all of these things base things on peak seasons and early productive seasons. So if you have a very early productive peak season, say a very huge freshman season, you have then broken, or you've then hit every threshold. And by hitting every threshold, nothing you do for the rest of your career matters. And I think that's the thing. Now, obviously, a lot of people do models differently, but I think for a lot of models, that is true. So if you have the Xavier Worthy freshman season, nothing you do for the rest of your career will matter in the analytical production, big picture metrics that a lot of people look at for correlations and things that you find on like Player Profiler or things like that. And I'm pretty sure that's true for the Player Profiler side of things. But the point in that is that for me, as much as that freshman season put him not just on the map, because he was on the map by his high school prospect status, but way, way, way on the map as an elite person to keep an eye on, he did not live up to it the following 2 years. Not only did he not live up to it, but I feel like something weird happens when someone gets over 1,000 yards, and I don't mean to, I'm going to say something about 100-yard games soon, so I don't want to talk outside of both sides of my mouth, but it's really weird to me because usually players have 12, 13 game seasons, and Xavier Worthy had 14 games and he only got over 1,000 yards in his 14th game. And like, if Texas doesn't make the playoff, Xavier Worthy, like say they don't beat Alabama and they beat Oklahoma, I think they might not make the playoff because of the fact that the Alabama one was so important to their resume. And in that situation, Xavier Worthy probably plays 13 games and doesn't play 1,000 yards. And my point is, I've just heard so many times, how can you say he doesn't have great production? He had 1,000 yards, and it's just like this. I think one thing to always keep in mind with athleticism is you can make the argument, and I understand it sounds very subjective and pessimistic, but you can make the argument that, like, this guy played in the Big 12, which is not the SEC. He runs a 4.21, and he had 3 100-yard games in the last 2 years. Okay, why isn't he doing more then? Like, if we're saying he's running a 4.21, why is he not doing more at the Big 12 level? Because the Big 12 is a good college level, but it is not a great NFL talent level. And my biggest problem with Xavier Worthy is just all the production statistics that come from Xavier Worthy the last 2 years on deep passes. Now, I want to make one thing very clear here, in that there's obviously another side to a lot of coins, and the other side here is the idea that Quinn Ewers is not good with deep balls. Quinn Ewers being the starting quarterback of Texas, there is some viable concerns with both with his own completion percentage on deep passes being very bad. But what I'll say up front, this is before I get into the data, this is my opinion. The numbers are so bad, it has to be one of a couple things, right? There's no way these players, in my opinion, are actually good at this, and things are just going wrong. Now, they could get better. They're young enough that they could both get better at this to where they both are good at the NFL level. That's certainly theoretically possible, but right now, something's bad. Something's given here. And it's either Xavier Worthy is very, very bad at catching the deep ball, Quinn Ewers is very, very bad at throwing the deep ball, or what is my opinion, they're both at least very bad. And to get into some of these numbers, Xavier Worthy has caught 15 of 67 deep passes beyond 20 yards the last 2 seasons. That is a catch percentage of 22%. Now, obviously, your catch percentage is going to be lower on passes beyond 20 yards, but it should not be this low. And just to put some perspective numbers on it, so Xavier Worthy's average per year, I was not able to build a leaderboard with 2 years on the website I'm using. I was just able to look at each year individually. But Xavier Worthy's average targets per year was 33.5. I used 25 as a minimum. So in 2022, out of 41 qualified wide receivers, 22% would have been 40th of 41. And in 2023, it would have been 32nd out of 35 qualified wide receivers to have at least 25 deep targets. It's also worth noting that 40th of 41 was actually where Xavier Worthy actually was on that leaderboard in 2022. Now, again, I do not think Quinn Ewers is great at the deep ball, and I'll cover Quinn Ewers when I do my 2025 show after the draft, but it's important to note that A.D. Mitchell was better in this category, and J.T. Sanders was better in this category. Now, there's some data sampling things, right? A.D. Mitchell was only there 1 year. J.T. Sanders got a very small number of targets per season, and he was actually very, very efficient in 2022 and very, very inefficient in 2023. But even his inefficient 2023, he was actually at like, say, 23 to 25%, which is still higher than Xavier Worthy's 22.4%. And my opinion is the reason that this is because Xavier Worthy, I have some questions about his ability to track the football. Well over a year ago was the first time I heard even people just in Devy leagues mention the fact that they didn't think Xavier Worthy was that good at tracking the football. And I just decided to keep an eye out for that. That's why I keep an eye out for some of these deep ball stats. That's why I'm kind of looking out for things like this. And I do think that, it's important to note that there's 2 ways to measure variables, right? There's variables that we get from the combine, like from 40-yard dashes, that don't really matter that much, but they're very objective because we've measured them in a very specific way. I don't know any way to measure ball tracking in anything objective, which is a very difficult thing for me in this show because I try to ground every subjective opinion that I have in some kind of objective reality. But what I will say is another thing I like to do, aside from finding, say, a deep ball stat that might just relate to it, is I don't love to use the NFL.com grades, Lance Zierlein's grades, directly for fantasy football. But I do like the fact that there is a detailed strengths and weaknesses section to where if there is a trait that I'm either excited about or bothers me with a prospect, I can look and see if the same trait is written about. And obviously, I've never talked to Lance Zierlein, so it's not like there's any kind of overlap there. It's just something, I mean, maybe you can say that whoever I originally was thinking about it from last year, maybe that also got into Lance Zierlein's year. But from my perspective, this is about as clean and fresh and not influenced as you can get. And I pull up Lance Zierlein's weaknesses, and the last Zierlein weakness on Xavier Worthy says fails to adjust his speed to ball placement consistently enough. Now, if true, this is what significantly bothers me about Xavier Worthy beyond just the idea of ball tracking, because when you put that into the practical reality of his frame, this is a 165-pound wide receiver with sub 9-inch hands. If he is not positioning himself well to catch a deep pass, he's not catching a deep pass unless he is so wide open that he's got like 10, 15 yards off people sometimes. And I don't know, he's got to break the game, I guess. That's kind of the point I'm getting at with Xavier Worthy when it comes to the deep ball. Now, obviously, maybe he can improve in this area. I'm not saying that that's not possible. But if this is the actual problem, I think he's got to break. He has to actually break the game with his speed to have a chance. Because all these guys that we talk about, smaller guys, I don't think Tank Dell has a problem tracking the ball. I don't think Tyreek Hill has a problem tracking the ball. And maybe Xavier Worthy doesn't either, but I have a significant enough concern with it that with the actual objective red flags, it is a combination of red flags that to me is the reason why I don't usually like to make comps in a very predictive sense. I don't like predictive comps. I like comps like my Keon Coleman comp, where I say N'Keal Harry's the bad one, Devontae Parker's in the middle, and Allen Robinson or Des Bryant's on top. That's what I like to do with comps. But for Xavier Worthy, a lot of people want a Deshaun Jackson. I see a lot of Tavon Austin the way you're going to have to use him at the next level. That's why I do not have a very high grade on Xavier Worthy. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but frankly, even where I'm getting at with the 8 to 13 is that if Xavier Worthy slips in the draft, I'm going to feel pretty corroborated in this feeling. Now, again, I don't expect him to slip in the draft. I expect him to go in the first round because that's what it seems everyone thinks he's going to do after running the 4-2-1. But if he does slip in the draft, that's going to confirm a lot of things I believe about this guy as a player, and so that's going to make me slipping down my rankings even more. I mean, if Malik Washington, I don't think this is going to happen, to be clear. I think this is like a 1% chance. But if Malik Washington got drafted over Xavier Worthy, I would absolutely rather have Malik Washington at this point, because at that point that would validate my concerns enough that I would be fairly out on Xavier Worthy to the extent that I would just, I'd rather just let it happen on somebody else's team. And I don't necessarily see the 4-2-1 as being indicative of upside necessarily in the way that so many others do. I mean, Puka Nacua was the biggest breakout in fantasy football last year, and he definitely didn't run anything close to a 4-2-1. And so that's all I have for today. I do want to acknowledge the fact that I want to improve this product visually. I'm just a bit behind even doing these things as they are right now for the video side of things. I might pivot soon to going back to releasing full podcast episodes on the YouTube, at least for a week or two. I'm trying with the ultimate goal being to get some research and development done so that I can do a couple more things that are going to be better for this channel visually for the long term. So please subscribe to the channel, as it will always have good content and it will continuously try to have better and better visual appeal. And check out the podcast to stay up to date with that as well. Goodbye.